He and his wife, Bernice, traveled widely, and at their deaths, they left an estate which provides funds for the university to hold an annual symposium. Their wish was that the symposium or conference discuss international affairs, governments and politics, including issues of historical, economic, geopolitical, social, or current affairs. Authorities in these disciplines shall be invited to the symposium or conference to lecture and discuss these issues with the students, faculty, and people of this region. When the planning committee met, starting last January, to consider topics for our Italy semester program, we all agreed that we had to include programs on the Italian-American experience. During the massive wave of European immigration between 1880 and 1914, close to 4 million Italians came to America for work, adventure, and opportunity. In the article, Why Italy, by my colleague, Dr. Alan Merriam, in this book, you will see that he identifies some of the more famous Italian Americans. To this day, increasing numbers of Italian Americans, more than any other ethnic group in America, celebrate their distinctive identity. When most of us think of the Italian American experience, the settings that come to mind are usually New York City, perhaps the Jersey Shore, and other places along the East Coast, such as my native Providence, Rhode Island, where some 2/3 of my high school classmates were of Italian American descent. In this morning's Gockel Symposium, Dr. Vincenza Scarpacci will examine the roads less traveled. The story includes Italians in lesser-known locations, such as farmers who raised and distributed vegetables that they introduced to the American diet, immigrants who played an in-between role in America's segregated South, or coal miners in the small towns of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and for that matter, Southeast Kansas. Just a preview, this afternoon we'll depart from our usual schedule. We will not have an evening Gockel Symposium. Instead, we will see a documentary film starting at 1 p.m. on one of the most famous incidents involving Italian-American immigrants, the Sacco Vanzetti trial. That'll start at 1 p.m. in Anderson Auditorium at the Criminal Justice Building. And Dr. Scarpacci will provide remarks that will place these events in context, both before the film and I'd say about 2/3 of the way through. Dr. Scarpacci, as you may have gathered, is admirably qualified to discuss the topic at hand. A native of Brooklyn, she earned a PhD in history at Rutgers University. She has taught at Towson State University in Maryland, Sonoma State University in California. Her publications include 3 books. The most recent, The Journey of Italians in America, published 2008, and that will be immediately after this program available for sale in the lobby. And Dr. Scarpacci will be pleased to sign your copy. Dr. Scarpacci was a founding member of the American Italian Historical Association. In addition to this book that I mentioned, she's also written A Portrait of Italians in America and Italian-American Immigrants in Louisiana's Sugar Parishes. She currently lives in Eugene, Oregon with her husband Peter, whom I met last night, had the privilege of meeting last night over a wonderful dinner. And she's currently researching the story of the Italian immigrants in Walla Walla, Washington. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vincenza Scarpacci. I should mention one other thing. At the conclusion of Dr. Scarpacci's remarks, she'll be glad to take questions from the audience. There are microphones in these 2 aisles. So after I talk to Dr. Scarpacci a little while, we'll welcome questions from the audience. Please just line up in front of the microphones. Thank you.
Good morning. It was nice to be introduced by a fellow East Coast person in the middle of the continent. Good morning, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of the Gockel International Symposium. What a special legacy you all enjoy year after year. As Dr. Tevereau said, my title is The Roads Less Traveled, and this reflects my personal mission as a historian, as well as the unexplored or roads less traveled aspects of Italian immigration. So today I'm going to discuss the role of Italian immigration, their interaction with African Americans in the South, variations on the pattern of chain migration, repatriation, the impact of returnees upon Italy, and the dark side of the immigrant experience, as well as the importance of Italian agriculturalists in America. My visit to Joplin adds to my knowledge of how Italian immigrants impacted America. On Tuesday of this week, I spoke in Tontitown, Arkansas, founded by Italian immigrants in 1898. And tomorrow I'll go to Pittsburgh, Kansas, Franklin and Frontenac, Kansas, settled by Italians and other immigrant miners. In fact, when I told my husband, a geologist, that I had been invited to come to Joplin, he looked at me and he said, coal, zinc. So I have, and usually when there were mines, often there were immigrants from different parts of the world, and most commonly Italian immigrants. Stepping out of the mainstream of historical research has been my mission in life. Topics through my career have always gone to the roads less traveled. As Paul said, I grew up in New York City and attended Rutgers University in New Jersey. But instead of writing a dissertation about Italian immigrants in New York or New Jersey, I decided to look at Italians working on the sugar plantations in Louisiana. Why? Because nobody had done research in that area. And also because Italians did go to the South. They did work on the land. They worked alongside African Americans. Okay. All right. In fact, in 1850, New Orleans had the largest number of Italian immigrants in America. Many immigrants lived in the French Quarter, which you're looking at now. This is a 1906 picture. And during the periods of yellow fever epidemics, and there were serious outbreaks in 1902 and 1905, Italians who lived in this crowded, rundown area were often blamed for spreading the disease when they commuted to the plantations for work. This is before, of course, we knew how yellow fever was in fact communicated. Interaction between African Americans and the immigrants extended beyond the cane fields where the two groups lived and worked together. In Louisiana and Alabama, Italian immigrants were in between, providing services for their African American neighbors and paesani, their fellow townsmen. This illustration is a picture of a saloon in the French Quarter owned by Vito Scorsese in 1915. This year is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and I'd like to honor the hero Nina Melanico of Birmingham, Alabama, who during her early career fought against the poll tax and helped get women on juries in Alabama. Here she's speaking to a group of African American women who belonged to Zeta Phi Omega, a service sorority founded at Howard University in 1920. In 1963, while the nation watched students fire-hosed and beaten while demonstrating in the city streets, Miss Nina, who was called nigger lover, Dago, and Catholic, won a seat on Birmingham City Council, where she helped negotiate a plan to integrate Birmingham schools. Even the horrific bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed 6 little girls on September 16, 1963, did not result in the closing of the newly integrated schools. Most historians follow the chain migration of immigrants from Italy to their American destination to describe how these communities formed. That is, they went from certain towns and villages or regions of Italy to certain towns and cities in the United States. But not all immigrants followed their paesani to their destination. Peddlers from Barga in Lucca traveled the byways of the United States, selling plaster busts of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington to customers with aesthetic and patriotic values. Itinerant workers heeded the call of companies needing labor for specific projects, like the Buffalo Bill Dam in Cody, Wyoming, on the Shoshone River, which was built as a project of the Federal Reclamation Act between 1905 and 1909. And it was the tallest and largest dam in the world. I went with my husband to the visitor center because, as you can see, this is quite an impressive dam, and they had a really interesting visitor center, but it did not indicate who the workers were who built the dam. So I asked the people there, and they didn't know, and there was a slick book about the construction of the dam, and I leafed through the book, and I saw this inset on one page which had a headline from the Cody Enterprise newspaper, "Had both eyes blown out." And I'll paraphrase and quote, "An unknown Italian laborer met with a terrible injury at the canyon this morning. As a result of a premature explosion of dynamite, both his eyes were destroyed. Blasting rock had touched off the charge of dynamite, and following the discharge, he was cleaning away the debris when his pick shovel struck a stick of dynamite which had not been dislodged. A terrific explosion took place right in front of him." Well, then I knew Italians were there, and I asked the visitor set of people who was the author, could I get in touch with her? She lived locally, and so I called her, and I said, "Do you know who the workers were?" So she said, "Well, no, I don't know their names, but they were Italians, Bulgarian, and Chinese. And also that they had to work during the winter months with sub-zero temperature, because during the summer there was such a terrific flow of water that they couldn't work in construction. So you can imagine what the circumstances were for all of those immigrants working in the Cody Dam. But no mention is given of the workers in the visitor center. Italians also were railroad track workers, maintenance people, and track workers throughout America. By 1900, studies estimated that 70% of the foreign-born workers on the railroads were Italian. And here we're looking at a maintenance crew in Terry, Montana in 1908. They're living in the boxcars behind them, and they are bringing a little of Italianità with them into the wilderness because they're baking bread in a dome-like oven, which resembles in some ways the ovens that their families used in Italy. Here we have an archaeological site along the historic Columbia Highway, which indicates also that the Italian workers who helped build the Columbia Highway in 1914 and 1915, which was supposed to be the gateway to the West. But in the visitor center there at the Columbia Gorge, a beautiful center overlooking the Columbia Gorge, there is no mention of the workers who built the Columbia Highway and that visitor center. Researchers estimate that about half of the proportion of half of the total of Italians who came to America returned to Italy. Now, that's difficult to get an exact figure because many of the immigrants, and most of them were men at the beginning of the immigration, they came here to work, that they went back and forth. They almost were commuters. And so the totals could be skewed one way or the other also because of this circumstance. But Roads Less Traveled also ignores this aspect of immigration. Here we have one returnee, Bernardo Mafucci, who is in front of his villa in Marzano di Nola in Avellino. He came to the United States early in the 20th century and went to Dunmore, Pennsylvania, where he worked as a coal boy for 50 cents a day. He fled this no-end job and went to New York City, where he worked in saloons, mostly in the German-speaking section of Brooklyn, which was at that point the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. And he tried different businesses, and finally he succeeded in establishing a successful taxi company and real estate company in Lynbrook, New York. He was so successful that at age 42, in 1921, he retired, and he and his wife went back to Italy, where he purchased his villa and brought some of his American know-how with him. Marzano, the town where they settled, Marzano di Nola, had no running water, and so he drilled an artesian well to obtain water for his olive oil process. He also sold water and delivered it to other landowners through a system of pipes he constructed. Barty had learned German when he lived and worked in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn. So during World War II, he understood the German soldiers in Italy. And later, of course, his knowledge of English cemented ties to the Allied forces who liberated his village. Success could have two sides of the coin, success and disappointment. Here we're looking at the man on the right, who's Sam Profetto, who's by a slag pile outside a mine in Michelle, British Columbia, where Sam's parents had worked for years. He was born in Michelle, British Columbia, and his parents and he went back and forth 5 times to work and earn money, which they used to buy land in San Massimo, Malaysia. And they were able to buy enough land and other businesses that they could employ people to work for them. And his parents remained in Italy. But Sam returned back to first Canada and then the United States with his wife, whose family had a different story. His wife, Anna, whose family came from the same town in Italy, her father and mother had come to the mines in Canada to work. But in 1914, her mother said, "I can't take this anymore." So she took the children and went back to Italy. And the father remained working in mines in Canada and the US for the rest of his life, sending money back home to his family. This is an almost success. The Chipari family emigrated from Orleo, Cosenza in 1890 and went to Frankfort, New York, which is near Utica, New York. It's upstate New York. They worked on the Erie Mohawk Canal. The whole family came over first, and then they went back to Italy, and they purchased some land and planted fig trees and an olive orchard, and worked another couple of years there, but they found that they could not make any money from their enterprise. So the father of the family, Giuseppe, went back to Frankfurt and worked a little bit longer, and then went back to Italy, but they still couldn't do what they wanted to do. So the father ceded his land to his eldest son, Giambattista, who is in this picture, and he, his wife, and his other two sons went to Argentina. Another aspect of Italian immigration, which is usually overlooked, is the idea of the impact of immigration upon Italy. We know that Bonnie Mafucci introduced some American technology to the small village of Marzano di Nola. But how did the flood of returnees impact their paese, their towns of origin, and their families and friends left behind? What happened there? In Italy, Italians are researching the history of their ancestors. There's much interest in immigration. There are immigration museums in Umbria and in Lombardia. And when I was in Italy in 2011, the town of Lucca had a wonderful exhibit about Lucchese in different parts of the world. It was a great exhibit. But none of these efforts, to my knowledge, show the impact of immigration on Italy's paese and its residents. But we can speculate. And here we have Angelo Bertucci and his wife Maria on their farm in Ustica, Sicily, which is an island off the north coast of Sicily. This is 1930. They're sending a card to their son in San Francisco, and they write on the back of the card, "Your dear parents, see how old they got? I will write in the future. I wait for your letters. Why don't you write? Dear kisses for everybody." While immigration provided opportunities for change, change also separated families and transferred a limited social network system to America. And here we have Stella Fioretti, who is in Carbonara, Bari, because she could not get a visa to come to the United States because she had a hiatal hernia. Her husband and son came to the United States, and she remained back in Carbonara with her daughter and ran a cantina. She wasn't reunited with her husband until 1950. And when her grandson in later years teased her, said, "Oh, Grandma, you were rejected." And I think that gesture shows what I'm going to quote about what she answered him. She said, "No good, manja anan, noting, Sodoma Beach," and included other swear words, half English, half Italian. As I said, she and her husband were reunited in 1950 when he retired from his job on the railroad in Washington State and rejoined with her in Carbonara, Bari. Across the continent, smaller circles of settlement developed, many by chance, such as the people from Carnocchio Chiete, who settled in the community of White Cloud in northeastern Kansas. As one of the descendants of this pioneer settler, Robert Severo wrote in the New Yorker magazine, "Always I was told they went because they had a friend, but surely there was somebody at one point who went and had no friend." So how did these communities start? Here we're looking at Charlie Naccarato and his friends on his front porch in Priest River, Idaho in 1914, where they're enjoying homemade beer. Well, Charlie Naccarato and his three brothers came from Grimaldi, Cosenza, and were working on the Great Northern Railroad. They were helping to construct the railroad as it went through western Idaho. And they saw that there was some land remaining to be homesteaded, and these men were farmers in Italy. So they decided to stay there and homestead. And they homesteaded, they raised some cattle, they carved wooden ties for the railroad, and they did some lumbering work. And here in 1914, they're enjoying the fruits of their labor. And of course, they established the beachhead for chain migration to continue to Priest River, Idaho. And here we have McAlester, Oklahoma, and This is John and Joe Facino's horse and buggy carriage repair shop in the background, and this is the float that they built for a 4th of July parade in McAlester in 1904. The area of McAlester and Krebs, Oklahoma, was a coal mining area, and many miners from all over the world, including many Italians, settled there. And when a beachhead was formed of Italian population, then immigrant entrepreneurs often followed to provide services and food to their paesani. Also, of course, they provided services for the general community, like this horse and this carriage and buggy factory. Also, the Facino brothers, these brothers, had a macaroni factory in McAlester, the McAlester Macaroni Factory, which produced Eagle brand macaroni that was marketed in Kansas, in Missouri, in Arkansas, and of course in Oklahoma. Here we see the Italian band in Parkersburg, West Virginia in 1923. Mr. Hirsch, who owned the United Woolen Company that manufactured men's clothing in Parkersburg, West Virginia, interested an Italian, Mike Carnevale, to be his recruiter to bring Italian tailors from Baltimore and Philadelphia to work for him in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And so this band, Italians often formed bands. Playing music was really part of their culture. And all of these men probably are tailors who worked for Mr. Hirsch. In fact, many of the men probably came from the same province in Italy. Well, what do we learn about the Italian experience? What accounts emerge from the Italian experience? How do we learn about the Italian experience? Of course, family histories, which are becoming very popular now, are a great source of information, and I use a lot of them in my book. But many family histories overlook details of dysfunctional families, of personal tragedies, of cultural conflicts. Community histories also help preserve the past, but many are completed without the assistance of archivists and trained researchers, so that photos aren't copied and placed in a collection where researchers have access to them. And sometimes oral histories are more anecdotal than they are in-depth interviews. Now, as I said, I was in Tontitown on Tuesday, and I can tell you that the Tontitown Museum is really an exception to this rule, and I really encourage those of you who can to make a pilgrimage to Tontitown. They're going to have their polenta schmear in November, so you can combine culinary experience with historical research. But as I said, most of these community histories are sometimes not in depth. And also on the other end of the scale, the Arcadia series stresses the Cinderella aspect of immigration. You know, you suffered and then you succeeded, and there is no harm done. And I don't imply malice here, just to say that they are only a beginning and a general catalog of information. Some accounts, like Dances with Luigi, written by Paul Palicelli, pictured here interviewing his father's first cousin in their ancestral town of Milanico Matera, and Mark Rotella's Stolen Figs, are successful ways of combining the shadows and the light of the immigrant experience and providing a historical context for the personal history. Also, the novels of Pietro di Donato, Christ in Concrete, and Mario Puzo's Fortunate Pilgrim capture the emotions and traumas of immigrant everyday life. I'll start this view of the dysfunctional side of immigration by talking about my grandmother, my father's mother, Angela Russo Scarpacci. She came to New York City from Sicily in 1902 when my father was 2 years old. We're told she was a very devout Catholic and found it very hard to adjust to life on the Lower East Side of New York. She became fearful and delusional. Ultimately, she was institutionalized first at Bellevue and then at Creedmoor, which was, in those days, way out on Long Island. She was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. Now imagine an illiterate Italian woman knowing no English in an Anglo institution for 20 years. My father made a trip out at least once a month, and it was not an easy trip in those days to visit his mother. Here we have Emilio Donati, who left Fulmabo Moderna in 1900 to work in the coal mines in Higbee, Missouri. He returned to Italy and married Francesca, who is pictured with here. They had 2 children. In this picture, it was taken in 1911. They moved to Bevier, Missouri, which was also coal mines, and he decided he didn't want to stay in the coal mines. It was too dangerous. So in 1917, he went to the consul in St. Louis, and the consul there told him about the Missouri colony was called Nauvoo then, but it's called Rosati now. And he went down there, looked it over, bought a farm, and he, for 2 years, worked there, built a house, bought farm equipment, but then they needed more money because you need money to start any kind of business, but also in a farming business, you have to tide yourself over until you get crops that provide you with money to support your family. So he went back to the mines, and a few months later, he was killed, leaving his wife, Francesca, at that time with 8 children. She was helped by her sons, who helped her raise some dairy cows and apple trees. And here we have the ravaged face of a woman, Maria Robati, who arrived in New York City from Fubani, Alessandria, in 1909. She was a healthy, vibrant woman when she came to the United States. She married Luigi here in the United States, and they had 4 children, one dying in infancy, before Luigi was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and sent to Central Islip Hospital on Long Island in 1922. A year later, Maria was similarly diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and sent to the hospital, and she gave birth to a child a few months later, so she was pregnant when she was sent into the hospital. This picture is copied from a hospital record, and it shows a woman ravaged by fears, confusion, and disillusion she experienced in attempting to adapt to a new environment. In Mario Puzo's novel, The Fortunate Pilgrim, the mother, Lucia Santa, commits her husband to an institution because she fears his unpredictable behavior. In Puzo's own life, his father, Antonio, a railroad trackman, became increasingly erratic and was finally diagnosed as schizophrenic and institutionalized. Most families couldn't tolerate the pain, the indignity, and the disruption they suffered when a member became mentally ill, and many chose to hide the loss and never told their children. Work dictates, this is Anselmo Minato and his son Narciso, who was nicknamed Cisco, in 1930 outside a sawmill in Chiloquin, Oregon, on Indian reservation in Chiloquin, Oregon. And Selma worked with a Swedish partner on the Green Line, which is the conveyor belt where the men take off the boards by size. And so they're separating them before the boards are brought out to the yards to dry off. In 1935, Anselmo was injured at work, and the resulting pain in his ankle and hip caused him to limp, and he wasn't able to get all the boards off the conveyor belt. So to save his job, he recruited his two sons, one age 11 and one age 10, to alternate. He was on the night shift. They would help him on the night shift, and they would take some of the smaller boards off the conveyor belt so he could do the other work. And of course, they were pretty darn sleepy the next morning. By 1939, his condition had so worsened that he went to the VA hospital, where the doctors confirmed his on-the-job accident had caused a fracture when he was first injured. The family received no compensation from the company. And here's Luigi DeSanta, who came to Pennsylvania in 1905. He got a job with a railroad company. He was so smart that they promoted him to a bookkeeper and store clerk, but he was injured on the job. He broke we only have two legs. He broke both legs, and the doctor put him together with plates and screws, but he never recovered from the accident. And in the 1930s, when a series of incidents happened to him, his son died at age 13, his nephew, who worked for the same company, was killed on the job. He went into a very serious depression, and he was institutionalized for the rest of his life. And of course, never got any monetary compensation for his leg injuries. All of these tragedies had an effect on the primary person involved, and of course influenced the way in which their families experience life. Now we'll get to the more positive side of roads less traveled, the contribution of Italian agriculturalists to America. And again, why isn't this studied more? Because again, the majority of immigrants settled in the populous cities along in the Northeast and the Midwest, because most of the immigrants came to America to find wage-earning jobs where they could bring money home to Italy to either buy land, buy more land, start a business, expand their business, pay for their sisters' dowries. And while hunger for land drove many Italians from Italy, they did not seek land here because, as I said before, you needed to have money to tide you over until your crops started to gain some income for you. About 67%, it's estimated, of the Italians who of the Italian working population in 1909, about 67%, it was estimated, came from agricultural backgrounds. But only 1 out of 16 Italians were working on the land, again, because they wanted wage-earning jobs. Okay, today we're in Joplin, and this is Tontitown in 1905, when the successful community is greeting the Italian ambassador who's making a visit to that town. And also, this is Rosati, Missouri, which was also founded around the same time. These two towns have a similar story. The immigrants who founded these towns were recruited in northern Italy to work as sharecroppers on Sunnyside Plantation, which is near Lake Village, Arkansas. Conditions there were so miserable and that the settlers left in two groups. One group followed Father Bandini to Tontitown, and the other group went to the Italian consul in St. Louis, who advised them to inquire with a railroad company for land that they owned in the vicinity of what was then Nauvoo, Missouri. But sometimes a little bit can produce a lot. Okay. Italians excelled in intensive agriculture in Italy. That's how they cultivated the land in Italy. Often they raised more produce per acre than their neighbors by using every inch of land and even planting crops between rows of fruit trees. And what did they grow? They grew crops for the nearby markets. And here we see the Rosati family in Hamilton, New Jersey, about 1914, hand planting sweet potatoes to bring them up to seedlings so that they can put them in the ground to cultivate them. And here's people picking sweet potatoes, and also they'll pick berries in Vineland, New Jersey. Now, these two towns, Hamilton and Vineland, are located near each other in southeastern New Jersey, and they were developed by a man who had Italian ancestry, but he also was a developer who wanted to develop colonies or communities where you had only small farmers, so people would be more egalitarian. So he offered the advantage to all farmers, and some people from New England came down. But then he discovered an Italian newspaper editor who published information in the papers, and Italians began to come to this part of New Jersey. Many of them were working in the cities, and they sought to go back to the land. And also, the Italian government and also the American government wanted to get rid of what they called slums and unseemly areas in the big cities, and they thought if Italians moved out to the land where they were familiar with how to provide for themselves, that their existence would be better. Italians continued to grow vegetables that they used at home in Italy. They grew these vegetables also to supply their co-nationals, and they introduced to their non-Italian customers new items such as asparagus, broccoli, artichokes, fennel, which they brought from Italy, and also they reintroduced peppers and zucchini, which originated in America but had become a mainstay in Italian cuisine since the 17th century. Southern Italy was the kingdom of two Sicilies, and it was ruled by the Spanish, and so you can see the trade routes bringing back these products from the Americas. Here we see Louis Sonsnaro in North Haven, Connecticut, whose father bought the land from a farmer that he earned the money from shoeing oxen in a brickyard in North Haven. And here he's showing his crop of peppers, which he brought into New Haven market. Italians continued to grow, as I said, every inch of the way. These are beautiful looking cabbages in Hanaran, Louisiana, which is north of New Orleans. This is a truck in Portland, Oregon, bringing produce from the farm into the city to sell to groceries, also probably markets. And this impressive delivery is Joe Desimone in Rainier Valley, which was referred to as Garlic Gulch, outside of Seattle, Washington. He came from a farm community in Avellino, came to Rainier Valley, where he worked for some of his relatives and paesani, because they came from about the same area. He and his wife rented land. They finally were able to purchase land, and I'll tell you some of the success story of Giuseppe Desimone. He purchased a stall in the Pike Place Market. He eventually became the director of the Pike Place Market, and he owned a lot of land, and he was quite significant in the history of Seattle. Italian farmers brought their produce to markets. Here's a market, open stall market in Erie, Pennsylvania, and many Italians ran these stalls in those markets, and today you still see Italian names on some of the produce stalls in markets. It's been handed down from generation to generation. Here we see Dominic D'Ambrosio in Portland, Oregon, selling vegetables and delivering them to his customers in what was the German-Russian section of Portland. And it was written in the paper, and the family confirmed this, that he taught James Beard's mother how to cook polenta. So maybe that had an influence on James Beard's culinary career. The peddlers also delivered produce to grocery stores. This is one in La Junta, Colorado. This is a store in the 1930s in Trenton, New Jersey. Some of the farmers also built cooperatives and marketing associations. This is 1916 in Walla Walla, Washington, where the Italian gardeners, and in the West they refer to themselves as gardeners, not farmers. They formed this association in 1916 so they could get more equitable returns for their produce from the markets, kind of eliminating the commission men. They also had a cooperative store in this association where they could buy Italian products and sell them and then get them on credit. And then when their crop was finished, they were able to pay for it with their produce. Here is Joe DeMarco in Tangipahoa Parish in Louisiana. The Italians were instrumental in building up the strawberry industry in Louisiana so that from 1919 to 1932, Louisiana was the largest growing strawberry state in the Union. And they had marketing associations and auxiliary businesses developed, a box factory, an ice factory, and they even had their own farmers' banks. And canneries, where you had produce, you had canneries, and this is a big one in Richmond, California. Distributing produce, this is DiGiorgio, which became a big, big corporation in America, but it started in Baltimore in 1905. So these distributing companies distributed not only what was grown locally, but imported fruits and vegetables from outside of the United States. Here's a company in San Francisco that transported produce and fruit from San Jose to San Francisco. Today, farmers are still continuing the heritage of their grandfathers, and some of the times it's their great-grandfathers. This is Ben Cavalli in Walla Walla, Washington, still growing the Walla Walla sweets that the Italian farmers in Walla Walla hybrided and made famous. This is the DeMeo family in Hamilton, New Jersey. This is in the 4th generation, and they claim to own the biggest blueberry farm in the United States. The Gonzales are still running their stall at Pike Place Market in Seattle. This is the Pioneer Distributors, which is now the Ranelli family in Portland, Oregon, still in the produce distribution business, and they supply most of the Northwest. What has happened to Italian Americans in the 20th century? How did the population dwindle? Well, part of it was for two types of migration. One was out-migration from the big cities, and here we see the sad story of the North End of Boston, which during the 1950s split the Italian community by building the arterial highway, which a few years ago they tore down and put into a tunnel, but this pretty much severed the community. And elsewhere in the United States, urban renewal was an important prospect that was put before the everyday life of people. But also, these areas of the cities were often run down and didn't have the amenities. They were crowded. they were sometimes substandard, and people also voluntarily left these communities. Also, there was part of it was white flight, and patterns of chain migration then also continue the flow outward. But also, Italians, like a lot of other people, moved to Sunbelt areas, some because of the harsh winters, some also to reestablish their businesses. And here is Nancy Pisani in Clearwater, Florida, which doesn't have an Italian population, and they decided to, instead of wintering in Patchogue, Long Island, where they and her brother-in-laws had 3 delis. They moved their deli down to Clearwater, and people were just anxious to have them open up their doors. But in the 21st century, it's not just Italian Americans who want Italian products, because if we are what we eat, then most of us are Italian, because from Pizza Hut to Mario Batali to the healthy heart Mediterranean diet, now garlic and olive oil are touted as health foods. Also, traditions migrate with people, and the San Gennaro Festival here is in Los Angeles, not in what everybody knows as the Big Feast in New York City. And although there is an Italian community in Los Angeles that goes way back to the days of the Spanish control of this area, the people who started this festival are transplants from the East who wanted to bring the San Gennaro feast to Los Angeles. Ethnic identity continues. The Italian Americans are the largest ethnic group that still claim Italian heritage, according to the census, where you were asked to claim what heritage you ascribe to. It's more than any other European ethnic group. And why? There's probably lots of variables. One is probably going back to Italy to visit your relatives, and this is first cousins meeting for the first time, or tourism to Italy. Continuing traditions like the St. Joseph's table here in Houston, Texas, where a number of different organizations combine it. It used to be a family tradition, but now it's a community tradition. So we need to know that not only these things continue, but also who was responsible for building our communities, and that we are giving credit where credit is due. And we should not only do this for Italian immigrants and Italian Americans, but we should also do this for other immigrant groups. The Italians built Cody Dam with the Bulgarians and Chinese. The Chinese dug the levees in the Sacramento Delta. The Irish built railroads. The expertise of Cornish and Welsh miners, Jewish tailors, Scandinavian domestics and lumber workers, African-American builders of Monticello and the capital in Washington, D.C., Mexican farm laborers and vaqueros, Japanese farmers and miners. And I think this symposium is a reflection of how we need to give credit and recognize those of us who have built this nation, and how we have brought some of our traditions here, and we have given them as gifts to be shared by others. And so our ethnicity can be a combination of our Italian heritage and our American existence. And here's the Italian Carabinieri Band playing on Liberty Island to salute that very concept. Thank you very much.
That was, for me, a very fascinating talk. I've had the opportunity to study some of the immigrant experiences, but you touched on aspects that I hadn't really thought of, both in terms of what the Italians experience, their effects. Since you said we tend to focus more on the Cinderella stories and don't look at the other aspect, one question occurred to me. In the course of your research, have you come across examples of Italians who moved to a place and then just found it wouldn't work? A community that had lasted for a while just folded.
Well, apart from Sunnyside, which is a really classic example of the Italians who moved to this cotton plantation, and they were subject to malaria. They're growing cotton, which they had not grown in Italy. So things were so miserable for them, they moved away. And I just imagine that in some cases, circumstances like the Ku Klux Klan in the World War I period, which was the new Klan, and the new Klan also moved to cities. They were not just rural, and they didn't only dislike African Americans, they disliked immigrants and Catholics. And the Italians were persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan because, number one, they were immigrants, and number two, they liked to make their own wine, and most of the Ku Klux Klan people were temperance people. And I've heard stories of Klans burning crosses on the lawns of Italian immigrants, or coming in into their homes and just breaking all the barrels of wine which the families made for their own consumption. And so things like that caused people to leave. But I don't, other than Sunnyside, I don't know about the whole group picking up and going.
Thank you. This is going off on a tangent a bit, but one thing that struck me, Italians were blamed for epidemics of yellow fever, malaria, but apparently also paranoid schizophrenia. And at a more serious level, this strikes me as strange. We have so many people being diagnosed that way. To your knowledge, have there been any studies done of this to the extent that we're talking more about a cultural disconnect than a clinical condition?
Well, it's not just with the Italians. Many immigrants followed the same path, because I've talked to a couple of psychologists, and they say paranoid schizophrenic symptoms, tendencies, is a disconnect with reality. And many immigrants were not able to absorb and adjust to what they saw as being strange, and instead of making their way around the barriers, they were overcome by the barriers. And so it wasn't just an Italian ailment. But you don't hear this in most families, because most families are not going to admit that grandma or great-great-uncle Giuseppe had this ailment, because a lot of people, especially in those days, believed that a mental illness meant something was wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to make sure in the 10 minutes or so that remain that the audience has the opportunity to ask questions. So please, if you have questions, approach the microphones, and I'm sure Dr. Scarpacci will be glad to answer them. My colleague, Dr. Greer.
I'm just wondering how language, this doesn't seem to be working. Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering how language retention, if anything that you had done related to that in terms of their native Italian.
I personally haven't done anything on language retention, but across the board, Woodrow Wilson said, we are not hyphenated Americans, we are Americans. America in the early 20th century until almost recently, let's say in the last 40 years, bilingualism was not considered an asset, and you were considered to be non-American if you spoke another language. And it wasn't only the first people, the Native Americans, who were sent to these special schools and were forced to give up their culture. I think many of the immigrants were told that by their teachers in the American public schools. And someone asked me about the language, and I think language is part of your culture. And although I have to admit that my parents did not teach me Italian, because as my mother said to me, I said, why didn't you teach us Italian? And I didn't say this until I was going to college, and a professor said to me, why, don't you know Italian? I said, no. So anyway, I went home and I said to Mom, why didn't you and Dad teach us Italian? Well, it was Sicilian, but still Italian. And she said, because, and this is the only time I heard pain in her voice. She said, because when I went to school, I only knew Sicilian, and the kids made fun of me, and I didn't want you to go through that. And it didn't occur to her that they were bilingual, my mom and Dad, and they would have taught me both languages. So it was quite interesting that that continued. Yes.
Sorry. First of all, thank you very much for coming out today. I really appreciate you being here. I know in your speech you mentioned several times about the Italian Council from whom the Italian immigrants would seek assistance. Could you perhaps elaborate on their role in the Italian immigration?
Good question.
Yeah, great question. The immigration agency was a governmental agency in Italy, was concerned for the care of the immigrants wherever they settled, in South America as well as in the United States. And these were people appointed by the authorities in Italy to be to facilitate problems. And sometimes they translated in courts. Sometimes they sent the remittances back to Italy. They helped them to do that. You have to remember that a lot of the immigrants were either completely illiterate or semi-literate. So negotiating in the American system was difficult. Also, my other grandmother, not the one that was institutional, no, she's my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother went to the Italian consulate because she wanted to go back to Sicily. And he gave her funds because people who were not able to pay their way back to Italy, they would allow that to occur. And then when incidents occurred, like the lynching of 11 Sicilians in New Orleans in 1891 and other kinds of incidents, the consuls went to investigate to see what was going on, to make reports, and also to send complaints, protests to the American law enforcement and the American justice system.
Dr. Wheeler.
I wish I'd written down what you said. You threw out a hint early in your talk about the place of Italian immigrants in the kind of American racial landscape. I think something along the lines of being in between black and white. I think, I hope I'm not reading into that. You know, James Lowen has written a book about, for example, about the Chinese in Mississippi playing that kind of role in between in terms of where they went to school, whom they married, et cetera, et cetera. And there's now a whole academic industry on how some European ethnic groups, quote, became white, usually focused on Jews and Irish. But have you come across any of these issues in your research?
Well, my dissertation on Italians in Louisiana goes into detail about this in-between role and how Italians were criticized because they would serve African Americans. Also, in the plantation payroll books, there were 3 categories. There were colored, there were Italians, and there were white workers. Wow. So Italians were neither white nor colored. And in the South, Italians tended to be more accepting at this point of African Americans. And that was an opportunity that a lot of entrepreneurs followed to provide services to the African American population, and they also would employ African Americans. But on the plantations, they lived next to each other, they visited each other, they had a everyday workers community on the plantations. And I would suggest that you read my essay in a book called Are Italian Whites? It's called Walking the Color Line. And I think the Southern experience is different from the Northern experience. And I just can, from a personal point of view, I never check white on government things because I am not white. I am not African American, I am not Asian, I am not Hispanic, but I am not white. I am European, but I usually check, and when they say other, I say Sicilian American. Because we need to respect that all of us come from diverse heritages. And those of us who are multi-ethnic, we get to celebrate them all.
Would you say that the overall experience of the Italian immigrants was any more or less pleasant or unpleasant than other immigrants?
Well, it depends if you introduce race, because Italians were not treated the way Chinese or Japanese were treated.
I was including that. Yes.
Oh, okay, other Europeans. Other Europeans, you mean? Contrast them with other Europeans?
Everyone, just everyone. Like
Yeah,
that.
I'm saying that they were not treated as badly as the Asians were treated here, because the Asians were not even allowed to become American citizens, whereas Italians could become American citizens. But there was a distinction in the immigration rules and regulations for incoming Italians. The Italians were listed as Italians and Southern Italians, and Southern Italians were not considered to be as good as the Northern Italians, who were supposedly more closely connected with the Northern European traditions. And 85% of the Italians who came to the United States were from Southern Italy. So there was this also official distinction between, quote, good Italians and not so good Italians, these Italians who could not assimilate, who could not become good citizens, who didn't come from democratic situations. And so there was this discrimination, but whether it was worse than anybody else, I don't think so, because the Poles were also looked down upon, the Greeks were also looked down upon, all of these groups, especially Southern and Eastern European groups. And in the 1920s, restriction laws were passed to make sure that the United States would no longer get people from this part of the world.
Well, I'm being reminded that
Yes.
it's 10:45. And
Thank you.
I could talk more out
I'm
there.
quite sure. So Dr. Scarpacci will be in the lobby to sell her books, and she'll probably have the opportunity to answer a couple more questions too. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Scarpacci.